The wind howled like a dying beast through the bitterroot pines, but it was the sound beneath the storm that made Gideon reach for his Winchester. A frail, desperate pounding at his cabin door. Midnight, a winter blizzard, and a tiny voice pleading, "Please. My mama needs help." The year was 1883, and the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana were no place for the weak, the unprepared, or the broken-hearted. Gideon Hayes was only two of those things. He was strong as a draft horse and knew the wilderness better than he knew the lines on his own calloused hands, but his heart had been shattered 3 winters ago. Gideon was a man carved from cordwood and sorrow. He lived in a solitary cabin perched near the timberline, far above the bustling, greedy mining towns of the valley. He had come up here with his wife, Martha, to build a life away from the smoke and noise. But the mountains were a cruel mistress. A sudden, vicious winter storm, much like the one currently raging outside, had trapped them inside. Martha had caught a fever, and with the passes blocked by 10 feet of snow, no doctor could reach them. Gideon had watched her slip away, helpless, holding her hand as the fire died down. Since that day, he had sworn off the world. He spoke to no one, traded furs only twice a year, and let the silence of the high peaks become his only companion. Tonight, the mountains were screaming. The blizzard had rolled in just after dusk, a blinding wall of white that dropped the temperature to 30 below. The timber groaned under the weight of the ice, and the wind drove snow against the log walls with the force of buckshot. Gideon sat by the stone hearth, nursing a tin cup of black coffee, staring into the flames. He was 36, though the silver in his thick, dark beard and the deep lines around his pale blue eyes made him look 50. Then came the sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was so faint, Gideon almost dismissed it as a frozen branch striking the wood. But his survival instincts, honed from years of hunting elk and tracking bear, told him otherwise. It was rhythmic, intentional. He set his coffee down, the liquid rippling, and stood up. He reached up to the mantel, pulling down his Winchester rifle, his thumb resting on the hammer. Outlaws and drifters sometimes got lost in these parts, driven desperate by the cold. He moved to the heavy oak door, unlatching the iron bolt, and pulled it inward. The wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it against the inside wall. Snow blasted into the room, instantly dusting the floorboards in white. Gideon raised his rifle, squinting into the blinding gale. There was no outlaw. There was only a ghost. Standing on his porch, buried up to her knees in a snowdrift, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She wore a thin wool coat that was entirely inadequate for the killing frost, and a ragged blanket was wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her face was deathly pale. Her lips tinged a dangerous shade of blue, and her eyelashes were heavy with frost. Gideon immediately lowered the rifle, shock piercing through his hardened shell. "Mister," the little girl whispered, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the wind. She swayed on her feet, clutching the doorframe with a tiny ice-covered mitten. "Please. My mama needs help. She's in the snow." For a fraction of a second, Gideon was paralyzed. The memories of his failure to save Martha threatened to suffocate him. But the sight of this freezing child snapped the ice around his heart. He dropped the rifle, lunged forward, and scooped the little girl into his arms. She was as light as a bundle of dry kindling. He kicked the door shut against the storm, leaning his weight into it to force the latch closed. Carrying her to the hearth, he set her gently on the bearskin rug. He grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from his own cot and wrapped it tightly around her shivering frame. "What's your name, little bird?" Gideon asked, his voice rough from years of disuse, yet surprisingly gentle. "Penny," she chattered, her teeth clicking together. "Penny," he repeated, moving quickly. He threw 3 more logs onto the fire. "Where is your mama? How far?" The wagon broke, Penny stammered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The horse ran away. Mama told me to follow the smoke. She told me not to stop." Gideon looked at the chimney. He had kept a roaring fire going all night. The smoke must have been barely visible through the whiteout, a singular beacon of hope. The fact that this child had made it up the ridge in this weather was a miracle. But if her mother was still out there, Her time was measured in minutes, not hours. "You stay right here, Penny. Do not move from this fire," Gideon ordered. He didn't hesitate. He pulled on his heavy canvas coat, lined with wolf fur. He strapped on his snowshoes and grabbed a thick coil of rope. Then he went to his supply closet. He didn't just take one lantern. He took all 6 kerosene lanterns he owned. Gideon stepped back out onto the porch, the storm instantly trying to push him back inside. Working with furious speed, he lit the wicks of 5 lanterns, hanging them on the heavy iron hooks along the eaves of his cabin. They flared to life, casting a brilliant, warm glow that cut through the blinding snow. He lit the last lantern, holding it high. It would be a lighthouse in the sea of white. He would not lose his way back. Not tonight. Not again. Lowering his head against the driving wind, Gideon found the tiny, rapidly filling footprints Penny had left behind, and he plunged into the darkness. The cold was a physical entity, biting at any exposed skin with razor-sharp teeth. Gideon pushed through waist-deep drifts, the golden glow of his lantern sweeping across the chaotic landscape. He followed the faint depressions in the snow, knowing that the wind would erase them completely within the next 5 minutes. He moved down the ridge, his snowshoes keeping him afloat on the powdery surface. As he descended, the terrain grew steeper and more treacherous. This was the trail that led past Dead Man's Drop, a sheer cliff face that fell 200 feet into a rocky ravine. If a wagon had tried to navigate this pass in the dark, it was suicide. "Hold on," Gideon muttered to the wind, his breath pluming in white clouds. "Just hold on." 10 agonizing minutes later, the lantern light caught something unnatural in the landscape. Wood splinters. A broken wheel rim. Gideon hurried his pace, sliding down a steep embankment. Through the swirling snow, the dark shape of a shattered buckboard wagon emerged. It was hanging precariously over the edge of Dead Man's Drop. The back half was suspended entirely in the air, the wind rocking it back and forth with terrifying creaks of straining timber. The front axle was caught on a large, ice-covered boulder, the only thing keeping it from plummeting into the abyss. Of the horses, there was no sign. The leather traces had been cut clean. "Hello," Gideon roared over the wind. A faint moan answered him from inside the covered portion of the wagon. Gideon tied one end of his heavy rope around a sturdy, ancient pine tree leaning over the trail, and secured the other end around his own waist. He couldn't trust the stability of the wagon. He approached cautiously, the wood groaning in protest under his weight as he stepped onto the tilted floorboards. Inside, the lantern light revealed a chaotic mess of overturned crates and torn canvas. Pinned beneath a heavy wooden trunk was a woman. She was unconscious, her dark hair matted with blood from a nasty gash on her forehead. Even in the dim light, and covered in dust and frost, Gideon could see she was fiercely beautiful, but deathly pale. Her breathing was shallow, a faint mist escaping her lips. "Ma'am," Gideon said, sliding his hands under the heavy trunk. He gritted his teeth, his massive shoulders bunching under his coat, as he heaved the trunk upward and shoved it aside. The wagon shifted violently. The wood screeched against the rock. The back wheels slipped another 2 inches into the void. Gideon didn't have time to be gentle. He grabbed the woman by the shoulders of her dark velvet coat and hauled her up into his arms. She was limp, her head falling back against his chest. Crack. The front axle snapped. The boulder gave way. Gideon lunged backward, clutching the woman tightly. He threw his weight toward the solid ground just as the entire buckboard wagon tipped backward and vanished into the swirling white abyss. A few seconds later, a muted, distant crash echoed up from the bottom of the ravine. Gideon lay in the snow on his back, breathing hard, the woman resting heavily on top of him. The rope taut around his waist had kept them from sliding over the edge. He checked her pulse. It was faint, but there. "All right," Gideon panted, scrambling to his feet and lifting her into a fireman's carry. "Let's get you to the light." The trek back up the mountain was the hardest physical trial Gideon had endured in years. The wind fought him every step of the way, trying to push him back down the ridge. His muscles screamed, and his lungs burned with the frigid air. But every time he wanted to stop, he thought of little Penny sitting by his hearth. and he forced his snowshoes to take another step. Finally, the glowing amber lights of his cabin emerged through the blizzard. The 5 lanterns burned defiantly against the storm. Gideon kicked the door open and staggered inside, enveloped instantly by the blessed, life-saving heat of the fire. Penny was curled up on the rug, fast asleep, exhausted by her ordeal. He kicked the door shut, bolted it, and carried the woman to his own bed. He laid her down gently, brushing the snow and ice from her hair. He needed to assess her injuries, bind the head wound, and get her out of the freezing wet clothes before hypothermia claimed her completely. He filled a basin with warm water from the stove and grabbed a clean rag. Returning to the bed, he began to unbutton the thick velvet coat. As he pulled the heavy garment open, his hands brushed against something hard and metallic strapped to her waist. Gideon frowned. He pulled back her wet blouse slightly. Strapped tight to her ribs was a heavy, waterproof leather saddlebag, and tucked securely into a holster right beside it was a silver-plated double-barrel Remington Derringer. Gideon's brow furrowed. Stranded travelers in the Bitterroot didn't usually sleep with loaded hideaway guns strapped to their bare skin. Carefully, he unbuckled the leather pouch to check for broken ribs beneath it. As the flap fell open, the firelight caught the contents. Gideon's breath hitched. The bag was stuffed to the brim with thick stacks of United States Mint gold certificates, thousands of dollars. And folded neatly against the money was a crisp, heavy stock piece of paper. Gideon pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a bounty poster. The sketch showed a man with cold, dead eyes and a jagged scar across his cheek. The name below read, Josiah Preacher Stone, wanted for murder and train robbery, $5,000 reward. But what made Gideon's blood run cold was the red stamp across the bottom of the paper. Property of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Classified. Suddenly, the cold barrel of the Derringer was pressed firmly against Gideon's throat. He froze. He looked down. The woman's eyes were wide open. They were a striking, piercing hazel, filled with a mixture of desperate terror and absolute lethality. Despite her severe head wound and her shivering frame, her hand was rock steady. She thumbed back the hammer of the little gun with a sharp, metallic click. "Step away from the money, mountain man," Abigail Montgomery whispered, her voice a raspy, venomous thread. "Or I'll paint this cabin with your brains." Gideon did not raise his hands. He did not flinch. The cold steel of the Remington Derringer pressed into the hollow of his throat, but his pale blue eyes remained fixed on Abigail Montgomery's face. He could see the tremor in her wrist, the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her mouth, and the desperate feral light of a mother pushed to the absolute brink. "If I wanted your gold, ma'am," Gideon said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated against the barrel of her gun, "I would have left you hanging over Dead Man's Drop. You're bleeding, you're freezing, and your daughter is sleeping on my rug." At the word daughter, the lethal focus in Abigail's eyes shattered. She gasped, a ragged, painful sound, and her head snapped toward the stone hearth. There, bathed in the warm, flickering light of the fire, little Penny lay curled beneath the heavy woolen blanket, her chest rising and falling in deep, peaceful slumber. The Derringer slipped from Abigail's grasp, clattering onto the floorboards. The last of her adrenaline vanished, replaced by a wave of dizzying agony from the gash on her forehead. She swayed, her eyes rolling back, and would have fallen if Gideon had not caught her by the shoulders. "Easy now," he murmured, easing her back onto the pillows. "The storm is outside. You're safe here." He turned away to fetch a needle, heavy silk thread, and a bottle of rye whiskey from his medicinal cabinet. When he returned, Abigail was watching him with a guarded, calculating gaze. She was a woman accustomed to danger, and trust was not a currency she spent lightly. "Drink this," Gideon instructed, offering her a tin cup holding 2 fingers of the amber liquid. "It will dull the pain. I have to stitch that wound before it gets infected." Abigail took the cup with shaking hands and swallowed the whiskey in one fiery gulp. She didn't cough. "My name is Abigail," she rasped, handing the cup back. "Abigail Montgomery. And you are?" "Gideon Hayes. You saved my little girl, Mr. Hayes. I owe you a debt I can never repay." "You owe me nothing. Gideon said softly, soaking a clean cloth in the whiskey. "Brace yourself. This is going to bite." He pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to her forehead. Abigail hissed, her fingers curling into the blanket, but she didn't cry out. As Gideon worked, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble with the needle and thread, the silence in the cabin stretched out, filled only by the howling wind outside and the crackle of the fire. The physical proximity was undeniable. Gideon could smell the scent of damp wool, gunpowder, and lavender soap clinging to her skin. Abigail looked up at his face, studying the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes and the silver threaded through his dark beard. There was a profound sadness in him, a mirror to the hollow ache she carried in her own chest. "A woman traveling alone with a child in a blizzard is strange enough," Gideon said, tying off the final stitch and snipping the thread. "A woman carrying $5,000 in Union Pacific gold certificates and a Pinkerton bounty poster for the most dangerous outlaw in the Dakota Territory is a story waiting to be told." Abigail let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. She reached down, pulling her heavy coat tighter around her shoulders. "It's not Union Pacific money, Mr. Hayes. It's Pinkerton money. Operating funds. And I am not a helpless traveler." She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and pulled out a heavy silver star. It caught the firelight, the unmistakable, unblinking eye of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. "That badge belonged to my husband, Thomas," Abigail said, her voice turning brittle with suppressed grief. "6 months ago, Josiah Stone and his gang held up a train outside of Cheyenne. Thomas was the agent assigned to guard the express car. Stone didn't just rob the train, Mr. Hayes. He executed my husband. Shot him in the back while he was trying to negotiate for the passengers' lives." Gideon sat back in his wooden chair, wiping his hands on a towel. He understood grief. He knew the taste of it, the suffocating weight of it. "So you took his badge and the operating funds. I am officially deputized as a widow's proxy by the Chicago office, though Alan Pinkerton himself would likely hang me for what I'm doing," Abigail confessed, her hazel eyes locking onto Gideon's. "Stone is a coward. He hides in the high country where the law refuses to go. But he has a weakness: greed. I spent the last 3 months spreading rumors through the mining camps that a Pinkerton widow was fleeing to Oregon with a fortune in recovered robbery cash. I made sure he heard it. I made sure he tracked me." Gideon's blood ran cold. He looked toward the heavily frosted windows. "You used yourself and your daughter as bait? Penny was supposed to stay with my sister in Denver," Abigail snapped, a flash of maternal guilt and fury crossing her face. "But the gang moved faster than I anticipated. They ambushed us on the road before I could put her on the train. We had to run. They chased us into the Bitterroot, the broken axle on the wagon. That wasn't an accident. Caleb, one of Stone's men, shot the trace just as the blizzard hit. The horse bolted." Gideon stood up slowly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together with terrifying clarity. He walked to the window, scraping away a patch of ice to look out into the blinding white maelstrom. "Mr. Hayes," Abigail asked, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "When I went out to find you," Gideon said, his voice grim, "I lit 5 kerosene lanterns and hung them on the eaves of the porch. I needed a beacon to find my way back through the whiteout." Abigail's breath hitched. "A beacon? If Stone and his men were tracking you down that ridge—" Gideon turned back to face her, his hand already reaching for the Winchester. 1,873 resting against the wall. They didn't freeze to death in the dark. They saw the light. As if on cue, the deep, resonant bark of a high-caliber rifle echoed through the howling wind, and the front window of the cabin shattered inward in a shower of glittering glass. The kerosene lamp on the dining table exploded, plunging the room into chaotic shadows cast only by the hearth fire. "Get down!" Gideon roared. Abigail didn't hesitate. She rolled off the bed, ignoring the agonizing throb in her head, and threw herself over Penny by the fireplace. The child woke with a terrified shriek, burying her face in her mother's chest. "Keep your head down, baby," Abigail whispered fiercely, drawing her derringer. Gideon kicked over the heavy oak dining table, using it as a barricade against the shattered window. He racked his Winchester. How many men? 3. Stone, Caleb, and a tracker named Bates. Abigail yelled over the storm. Stone carries a Sharps buffalo rifle. Thoom. A massive slug tore through the heavy log wall, spraying wooden splinters. Gideon calculated the trajectory and realized their fatal flaw. The attackers were firing from the dark tree line, using Gideon's own porch lanterns to illuminate the cabin. I need to put those lanterns out, Gideon muttered. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, aiming through the shattered window at his own porch. Crack, crack. One by one, he shot the glass lanterns, plunging the exterior into darkness, until only a single flickering light remained. They're moving up, Abigail warned, peering around the hearth. Stay with the girl. Keep their attention front, Gideon ordered. He slipped out the side door into the biting cold. Outside, the wind tore at him as he flanked his own cabin. At the front, Bates crept up the icy stairs with a shotgun, while Caleb reloaded his revolvers behind the woodpile. Abigail didn't wait for them to breach. She leaned from the hearth and fired her derringer, clipping Bates in the shoulder and sending him tumbling down the steps. As Caleb raised his guns to lay down suppressing fire, Gideon emerged from the blinding snow. Forgoing the rifle for close quarters, he tackled Caleb into a snowdrift, driving the heavy hilt of his hunting knife into the outlaw's temple. Caleb went limp. Gideon scooped up the dropped Colt and spun around, firing twice into Bates just as the tracker tried to recover. 2 down. But where was Stone? Hayes! Abigail screamed from inside. The roof! Preacher Stone had used the blizzard's cover to scale the rear snowbank. He stood near the stone chimney, a massive silhouette holding a sputtering bundle of dynamite. You want the money, preacher? Abigail shouted, stepping boldly into the shattered window. She held the heavy saddlebag out. Stone laughed over the wind. I'll dig it out of your ashes, widow. Before he could throw the explosives, Abigail hurled the saddlebag up onto the icy porch roof. The distraction worked perfectly. Stone's greedy eyes darted to the fortune. Gideon fired. The bullet struck Stone's thigh. Bellowing in pain, the outlaw slipped, dropping the dynamite. It rolled off the roof into a deep snowdrift, detonating with a muffled whump that shook the earth but spared the cabin. Stone slid off the icy shingles, crashing heavily onto the porch below. As he groaned, reaching for his pistol, the front door kicked open. Abigail stepped out, holding Gideon's Winchester. She walked toward the bleeding outlaw, her face pale and utterly devoid of mercy. You ain't got the stomach for it, Pinkerton, Stone coughed. This is for Thomas, she whispered. The blast echoed across the mountains, and then there was only the sound of the wind. Gideon walked to the porch as Abigail lowered the rifle, her hands shaking violently. She sank to her knees in the snow, sobbing from the release of a burden she had carried too long. Gideon knelt beside her, pulling her against his chest, shielding her from the bitter cold. In that moment, the ice around his own heart finally broke. Hours later, dawn broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, leaving a pristine blanket of white. Inside, Penny sat happily at the table, eating warm oats, oblivious to the bodies dragged out to the tree line. Gideon poured 2 cups of coffee, bringing them to the hearth where Abigail sat wrapped in a blanket. The pass will be blocked for weeks, Gideon said softly. You and Penny are welcome to stay here, as long as you need. Abigail took a sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. She looked at the scarred, gentle mountain man who had risked everything for a stranger. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. We might just take you up on that, Gideon. She smiled, light returning to her eyes. I think I've had enough running. Did Gideon and Abigail's frozen frontier romance melt your heart? The Wild West was a brutal place, but love and courage could survive the darkest blizzards. If you loved this tale of survival, vengeance, and a widowed mountain man finding his second chance, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with a friend. And subscribe to the channel for more thrilling historical romance audio dramas.